Some men reach their late 60s and make peace with the quiet. They learn to cook for one. They stop setting 2 cups out in the morning. They find a rhythm in the loneliness. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of manageable stillness that gets them through. And then one day, something shifts. A voice across a hotel lobby. A smile that costs nothing and means everything. And just like that, all that careful quiet gets thrown out the window. This is the story of a man who thought he'd finally found someone who truly saw him. He was right about that part. He just didn't understand what she was looking at. I remember the exact moment I stopped being careful. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Cebu City, and Analyn had just handed me a cold bottle of water without me asking for one. I'd been standing at the hotel check-in desk, sweating through my collar, trying to work out the difference between my reservation number and my passport number, and she'd reached beneath the counter and placed that bottle in front of me, with both hands, and a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. That was it. That was the moment. I know how small it sounds. A bottle of water. But I was 66 years old, and I had been alone for 4 years, and in 4 years nobody had handed me anything without me asking first. Not my children, not my colleagues at the firm before I retired, not a single person in the gray, efficient city of Leeds that I had called home for the better part of my adult life. She just handed me that water and said, "You look like you need this, sir," and I thought, yes, I do. I was in the Philippines for what I'd told myself was a holiday, a proper one, not the kind where you spend 3 days eating at familiar restaurants and come home with a fridge magnet. I wanted somewhere completely different, somewhere I'd never been, somewhere that didn't know my name or my history, or the fact that my wife Margaret had died of a stroke 4 years earlier, leaving me in a 5-bedroom house in Headingley, with her reading glasses still on the kitchen table. I hadn't moved those glasses. I want you to understand that. 4 years, and I hadn't moved them. My daughter Fiona had told me the trip was a good idea. She lived in Edinburgh with her husband and their 2 boys, and she worried about me in a practical, efficient way, the way people worry when they love someone but don't have the time to show it properly. She booked my flights. She found me the hotel. She said, "Dad, just go and be somewhere warm for a bit." And I'd said yes, because I'd run out of reasons to say no. My son Paul hadn't rung in 3 months. That's not relevant to the story, but it's part of why I was so ready to be seen by someone. I spent the first 2 days doing what retired men do on their own in tropical cities. I visited a church. I ate something I couldn't identify and enjoyed it. I walked along the waterfront in the early morning, when it was still cool enough to breathe. And on the 3rd day, when I came back to the hotel lobby after a long afternoon at the Basilica del Santo Niño, I found Analyn behind the desk again, and she looked up from her computer and said, "How was your afternoon, Mr. Pemberton?" And I nearly stopped walking. She remembered my name. Not because it was her job to remember it. She said it like she'd been thinking about whether I'd had a good time. "It was lovely, actually," I said. And then, because I hadn't had a real conversation with another adult in 3 days, I told her about the church. The old stone of it, the candles, the way the light came through the windows and hit the pews at an angle. That made me think of Margaret, who had been quietly religious, in a way I'd always admired but never shared. Analyn listened. She didn't glance at her screen. She didn't fidget. She just stood there with her hands folded on the desk and listened to me talk about a dead woman I still loved. And when I finished, she said, "She sounds like she was a very gentle person." I had to look away when she said that. We talked every evening after that. I'd come in from wherever I'd been, and she'd be there, and we'd spend 10 or 15 minutes just talking. About Cebu, about Leeds, about what I'd done before I retired, and what she hoped to do when she'd saved enough money. She was 30 then. She'd grown up in a barangay outside the city, and worked her way into the hotel through sheer persistence. 3 applications before they called her back. She had a younger brother in university, and a mother who was not well, and a rented room 20 minutes away by jeepney. She told me all of this in pieces, a little at a time, the way someone shares things when they're genuinely comfortable with you, rather than trying to impress you. On my 9th day in Cebu, I asked her if she'd like to have dinner with me on her night off. Not as anything. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't looking for anything. I just didn't want the conversation to end when the lobby did. She hesitated. I expected her to say no, and I'd already prepared the gracious smile I'd give when she did. But then she said, "I'd like that, Mr. Pemberton." And the gracious smile came out anyway, just for a different reason. We ate at a small restaurant near the waterfront. She ordered for both of us in Cebuano, and the food came out bright and generous, and nothing like what I normally ate, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was actually present somewhere, not managing the fact of being alive, but actually in it. She asked me about Margaret, not cautiously, the way people at home did, as if death were something you might catch, but directly, warmly, because she wanted to understand who I was. I told her things I hadn't said out loud in years, about how Margaret and I had argued too much in our 40s and found each other again in our 50s, and how the decade before she died had been the best of our marriage, and how the cruelest thing about losing her was that it happened right when we'd finally got it right. Analyn had tears in her eyes by the time I finished. Real ones. I could see the light from the street lamp catching them. "You must miss her every day," she said. "Every single one," I said. We sat there for a moment in the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, and then she said quietly, "I think you still have a lot of love to give, Mr. Pemberton. It would be a shame if nobody got to have it." I flew home to Leeds 10 days later, with her phone number in my contacts, and something warm sitting in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it wasn't what it was. I was good at that. I'd had a lifetime of practice at being sensible. I was a retired insurance underwriter, for God's sake. I spent 35 years assessing risk. I knew what an unlikely return looked like. I knew when the numbers didn't add up. But I also knew how I felt every evening when her name appeared on my phone, and I knew that I smiled at it in a way I hadn't smiled at anything since Margaret died. And I told myself that wasn't nothing. We talked every day. Voice messages mostly. Long ones. She'd send me a recording on her lunch break. 5, 10 minutes of her voice, telling me about a difficult guest at the hotel, or something funny her brother had said, or what she'd eaten for breakfast, and I'd listen to them in my kitchen in Headingley, with a cup of tea, and feel like the house was slightly less empty. I'd send one back. She always responded within the hour. She remembered everything. That's the thing I want to say clearly, because I've been asked since then whether I noticed, and the honest answer is that I noticed, and I loved it. She remembered that I preferred tea to coffee. She remembered that my late mother had been born in February, and would send me a small message on that date every year. She remembered the name of the colleague who'd made my last years at the firm difficult, and when I mentioned him in passing 2 months into our friendship, she said, "Is that the same Dawson you told me about back in September?" And I thought, she keeps me. She actually holds on to who I am. I went back to Cebu in January, 4 months after the first trip. I told Fiona I was going for the weather, which was true enough. She gave me a look over the video call that I chose not to engage with. Analyn met me at the hotel on my first evening, even though she was working. We had that same dinner at that same waterfront restaurant, and it felt like coming back to something, rather than arriving somewhere new. She'd done her hair differently. She looked beautiful. I told her so, and she looked down at her plate and smiled and said, "You always say kind things." By the end of that week, I'd told her how I felt. I did it carefully. I told her I understood the differences between us, the age, the distance, the circumstances, and that I wasn't asking for anything she wasn't willing to give, but that I wanted her to know that what I felt was real, and that I thought she was the most remarkable woman I'd met since Margaret. She took my hand across the table and held it for a long time before she spoke. "I've been hoping you would say that," she said. "I was afraid you'd go home again without saying it." I came home from that trip a different man. Fiona could see it immediately. She came down to Leeds the following weekend and watched me make breakfast and said, "Dad, you're humming." And I said, "Am I?" And she said, "You haven't hummed since Mum was alive." I didn't know what to say to that, so I made her more toast. The months that followed were the happiest I'd had in years. I'm not ashamed to say that. Analyn and I spoke every day. I visited Cebu every 2 to 3 months, staying longer each time. I brought her flowers. I brought gifts for her mother, and small things for her brother's university. Books, a scientific calculator she'd mentioned he needed. These felt natural. They felt like what you do when you care about someone's family. She was attentive in a way that never felt performed. On the days I mentioned feeling low, my knee playing up, old memories surfacing, the particular weight of winter in Leeds, she'd send longer messages, warmer ones. She never let me stay in a dark mood for long. She had a way of reframing things that I found genuinely comforting. She also had a way of learning me. I understand now that those are the same thing. She knew, for instance, that I played golf on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and was typically gone from the house by 7:30 and back by noon. She knew this because I'd told her about my Tuesday and Thursday routine during one of our long evening calls, in the context of explaining why I always had better signal in the afternoon. She knew that I kept my phone on the kitchen counter when I was home and in my jacket pocket when I was out. She knew my phone passcode because she'd watched me enter it, or thought I hadn't noticed her watching, on my third visit to Cebu when I'd unlocked it to show her a photograph. I'd thought it was charming, actually. I'd thought it meant she was interested in my life. I'd told her the code explicitly on my fourth visit, when she'd asked to look at something on my phone, and I'd said, "It's 4378, and handed it to her without a second thought. Why would I have had a second thought? She was the woman I was in love with. She remembered my mother's maiden name because I'd told it to her in the context of my childhood, a long story about my grandmother's house in Yorkshire that I'd shared one evening when we were both in a nostalgic mood. She knew the name of my first dog because I'd mentioned him while talking about growing up in the 70s. She knew the answers to every security question my bank had ever asked me, and she'd gathered each one the way you gather stones on a beach walk, slowly, without appearing to try, tucking them into her pocket when she thought you weren't watching. What I mistook for intimacy was inventory. The first sign that something was wrong came 14 months into our relationship. My bank, Barclays, the branch I'd used since I was 23, sent me a text alert about an online transfer that I didn't remember authorizing. It was for £400, sent to an account I didn't recognize. I rang the bank and the woman on the phone was patient and professional, and we agreed it was probably an error on their end and that I should keep an eye on things. I hung up and rang Analyn, and she said, "Oh, those alerts happen sometimes with older accounts. My colleague at the hotel had the same thing. It usually resolves itself." And I thought, she's probably right. She usually was. I did not look at my online statements that evening. I hadn't been in the habit of checking them. Margaret had handled our finances for most of our marriage, not because I was incapable, but because she was better at it, and we both knew it. And after she died, I'd let the bank manage things automatically. Direct debits, standing orders. I knew broadly what went out each month. I did not scrutinize. I wish I had. The second sign came 2 months later, when I was looking for a document on my laptop and noticed that my saved bank login had been cleared. I assumed I'd accidentally logged out. I re-entered my details and went straight to the page I needed without looking at the activity log. The third sign was more difficult to explain away, though I managed it. I was visiting Cebu, my 6th visit by this point, and I woke early one morning, before Analyn, and reached for my phone to check the time. The screen was already lit. She'd had it in her hand. She was asleep, or appeared to be. The phone was resting face down on the pillow between us. I told myself she must have picked it up by habit, half asleep. I told myself lots of things in those months. I was very good at it. The fourth sign was a conversation I had with my friend Jeffrey, who had retired to Spain and rang me every few months to check in. Jeffrey was a practical man. He'd spent his career in financial services, like me, and when I told him about Analyn during one of our calls, he listened carefully and then asked a few questions. Sensible ones. Had she ever asked for money directly? Had her circumstances changed since we met? Was I happy? I answered yes, no, and yes, in that order. And then Jeffrey said, "Just keep an eye on your accounts, mate. I'm not saying anything. Just keep an eye." I remember being mildly irritated by that. I thought Jeffrey was being ungenerous. I thought he was applying the wrong framework. The cautious, cynical framework of a man who hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt what I'd felt. He didn't know Analyn. He didn't know how she was. What Jeffrey knew, and what I was refusing to know, was that love doesn't make you exempt from risk. It makes you worse at assessing it. The call from Barclays came on a Thursday. I was back from golf, still in my jacket, making a sandwich in the kitchen. A woman named Sandra rang from their fraud department and said she'd been trying to reach me and that there was some activity on my account she'd like to discuss. I sat down at the kitchen table with the phone against my ear, and Sandra began reading me a list. 47 transfers over 14 months. The smallest was £200. The largest was £3,800. They went out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, almost exclusively, during the hours I was at the golf club. The total was £68,000. I said, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" She repeated it. I said, "There must be a mistake." She read me the destination accounts. There were 6 of them. Philippine bank accounts, Sandra said carefully, as if she were reading me a diagnosis. She said the transfers had been initiated through the mobile banking app using my login credentials and confirmed via the authentication code sent to my phone number. My phone number, the one Analyn had held in her hands hundreds of times. I defended Analyn for 20 minutes. I want to be transparent about that. Sandra was patient in the way that people are patient when they've had this conversation before and know how it ends. I said there had to be an explanation. I said the woman I was in a relationship with was a hotel receptionist who earned a modest wage and had never once asked me for money. I said she didn't need to steal because I gave her things freely, because I wanted to, because that's what you do when you love someone. Sandra said, "Mr. Pemberton, we flagged this account because the transfer pattern matches a known type of fraud. The timing correlates precisely with windows when we believe you were away from the device." I sat there in my kitchen with my sandwich half made, and I felt the ground become unreliable beneath me. I rang Analyn that evening. I didn't tell her about the bank call. I just talked to her, normally, or trying to be normal, and listened to her voice, and tried to find the lie in it. She asked how my golf had been. She said her brother had done well on an exam. She said she was thinking of visiting a friend in Dumaguete next month. And had I ever been there, wasn't it supposed to be lovely? I said I hadn't. I said it sounded nice. She said, "Maybe one day we'll go together." I got off the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. The bank helped me look at the full picture over the following week. Sandra had a colleague, a man named David, in their specialist fraud unit, and between the two of them, they walked me through exactly what had happened. The mobile app had been accessed from devices I didn't own, not my phone, but devices that had been linked to my account using my credentials, which meant someone had logged in, confirmed access, and effectively mirrored my account activity to a second device. "This is a method we're seeing more of," David told me. He said it with the dispassionate clarity of someone describing a weather pattern. "It requires access to the account credentials, the one-time codes, and typically the security question answers. The person responsible would have needed extended access to the victim's device over a period of time." The victim. That was the first time I heard myself described that way. David told me the 6 destination accounts were registered in the Philippines and had been opened in the 18 months prior to the first transfer. He said the money was almost certainly gone. He said there were avenues I could pursue: a report to Action Fraud, the UK's National Fraud Reporting Centre, with possible cooperation from Philippine authorities, but that he wanted me to be realistic about recovery prospects. I asked him what realistic meant. He said it meant unlikely. I rang Jeffrey that night and told him everything. He didn't say "I told you so." He just listened, and when I'd finished, he said, "What do you need right now?" And that was so unexpectedly kind that I had to put the phone down for a moment and breathe before I could answer. What I needed was to understand how I'd let it happen, but that was going to take longer than a phone call. I didn't confront Analyn immediately. I know that sounds strange. People ask me why I waited, and I find it difficult to explain in a way that makes sense. unless you've ever loved someone you're beginning to realize isn't who you thought they were. There's a period, I think it varies for everyone, where you hold both truths at once and can't quite make yourself collapse them into one. You know, and you also still believe. And you stay in that terrible middle place because the alternative is accepting that everything was a performance, and the man who performed alongside it, convinced he was living something real, was a fool. I needed a few days with that before I could face her. I also, if I'm honest, needed to check something. I went back through 14 months of voice messages on my phone. I listened to them in order, a few each evening, sitting in the chair by the window in the living room where Margaret used to read. I was looking for the script. I was looking for the moments where she'd gathered information, where she'd steered the conversation somewhere useful to her, where she'd asked a question that didn't need to be asked unless she was building something. It was there. It was everywhere, once I knew to look. What did you say your first dog's name was? I keep forgetting. My first dog. The answer to the security question on my savings account. Your mum's birthday is in February, isn't it? I want to make sure I remember the date. My mother's birthday. The month and year I'd given her separately, in 2 different conversations, combined to make the month-year code she'd used as part of one of my login verifications. What's the PIN on your travel card again? I want to get cash for dinner so you don't have to stop. She'd asked this once, in Cebu, and I'd told her without thinking. None of these moments, on their own, had felt like data collection. They had felt like affection. They had felt like a woman who cared enough to remember. And the thing is, and this is the part I keep coming back to, I'm not sure those 2 things were ever entirely separate for her. I don't think she woke up one morning and decided to perform warmth as a theft strategy. I think the warmth and the information gathering were woven together in a way she'd probably been doing for so long she didn't think about it consciously. That doesn't make it better. But it does make it more complex than simply being conned by a cold, calculating stranger. She was warm to me. That warmth was real in some form. It just wasn't innocent. My daughter Fiona came to Leeds when I told her. She drove down from Edinburgh on a Saturday morning and sat across from me at my kitchen table, and I explained what had happened and watched her face go through several emotions very quickly before she settled on a careful, controlled expression that I recognized as her trying not to say something she'd regret. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not angry at you." I said, "You can be. I'd understand." She said, "I'm not. I'm sad for you." And then she got up and made us both a cup of tea, and we sat there for a while without talking, and I was grateful for the quiet. She helped me file the report with Action Fraud. She sat beside me while I filled out the online form, and she didn't say anything unkind when I couldn't immediately recall certain dates or transfer amounts and had to look them up. She rang Barclays with me the following week and asked better questions than I would have thought to ask. She was efficient and practical, and it was only when she hugged me goodbye in the driveway that I felt her hold on a moment longer than usual. "Come up to Edinburgh for Christmas," she said into my shoulder. "Yes," I said. "All right." I confronted Analyn by message. I know that's not what most people would do, but I didn't trust myself on a phone call. I was afraid that if I heard her voice, I would begin making excuses for her before she even had to make them herself. So I typed it out, carefully, without anger, just the facts as I had them, and sent it on a Wednesday evening after supper. I told her I knew about the transfers. I told her I knew about the accounts. I told her I wasn't going to pursue it beyond the fraud report that was already filed, but that I wanted her to know that I knew, and that I was not going to pretend otherwise. I asked her only one thing. I asked her to tell me which parts, if any, had been real. She read the message. I could see the ticks. She didn't respond for 6 hours. When she finally did, she said, "I care about you. That was always true. I'm sorry. Nothing else. No explanation, no denial, no negotiation. Just that." And then her profile went quiet. I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it sometimes. I'm not sure care and exploitation are as mutually exclusive as I once believed. I'm not sure a person who does what she did is incapable of genuine feeling. I think the world is more complicated than the version where people are either good or bad, and that doesn't comfort me exactly, but it does help me to stop looking for the moment when she turned. Because maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it was always both things at once. The money is mostly gone. Barclays recovered a small amount, a little under £4,000, through the dispute process, and the rest has been written off as unrecoverable. £64,000, more than 3 years of my pension. Not enough to ruin me, because I'd been careful over a long working life, and Margaret and I had paid off the house years ago, but enough to matter, enough to feel. I've spent the months since trying to understand what it cost me beyond the money, and that accounting is harder to do. I lost a version of myself that I quite liked. The man who believed he could still be surprised by life. The man who handed his phone to someone he loved without a second thought. The man who felt happy humming in his kitchen on a Saturday morning. I've found parts of him again. Not all of them, but parts. Jeffrey came to visit in the spring. We walked along the canal path for a couple of hours, and he talked about Spain, and I talked about nothing in particular. And at one point he said, "You seem better than I expected." And I said, "I'm working on it." And he nodded, and we kept walking. Fiona came with the grandchildren for half-term, and the house was very loud for 4 days, and I loved every minute of it. My grandson Oscar, who is 7 and serious, told me very earnestly about the life cycle of a beetle he'd been studying at school, and I listened with genuine attention, and at one point, I caught Fiona watching me from the kitchen doorway with an expression I couldn't read, but thought might be relief. Paul rang in March. Out of nowhere, mid-afternoon, as if no time had passed. We talked for almost an hour. It was stilted in places, and I don't think either of us said the things we probably needed to say, but we said other things, easier things, and by the end, it felt like the beginning of something rather than an ending. I moved Margaret's reading glasses, finally. Not away. I didn't want to put them away. I just moved them to the shelf beside the window, where she used to sit. They're still there, but they're in a different place now, and that feels right. I still think about Analyn sometimes. Not in the way I once did. Not with that ache of missing someone you want back. More with a kind of tired curiosity. I wonder who she is without the performance. I wonder if she wonders about me. I wonder whether her brother finished his degree, and whether she still works at that hotel, and whether she's doing the same thing again with someone else. Someone new. Someone sitting in a lobby in the heat, being handed a cold bottle of water. I hope not. I genuinely hope not. Not because I want justice. I stopped wanting justice a while ago. I hope not, because I understand something now that I didn't understand before, that a life built on watching people closely enough to pick them clean is a lonely life too, in its own way. That whatever she got from me, she had to carry alone, and carry carefully, and that's not freedom. That's just a different kind of cage. At 67, I'm learning to be more present in my own life, to notice things, not to gather information. God knows I've had enough of that done to me, but just to be where I am, in this house, in this city, in this body that is still doing what I need it to do, mostly, on most days. I check my bank statements now, every week. I changed every password, every security question, every PIN. I let a financial advisor sit across from me and go through my accounts in a way I would have found embarrassing before and now find simply sensible. I go to golf on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I come home and I make my lunch and I ring someone, Fiona, Jeffrey, occasionally Paul, just to hear a voice. I don't miss being the man who trusted too easily, but I miss the feeling that came with it, the ease of it. The way loving someone openly, without audit, without reservation, made the world feel larger and warmer than it usually does. I don't know if I'll have that again. I'm 67, I'm not a betting man, but then again, I wasn't a betting man when I flew to Cebu the first time, and look what happened. The reading glasses on the shelf catch the morning light sometimes. Early, before I've made tea, I come downstairs and the light comes through the window and hits them, and for 1/2 second it's 4 years ago, and Margaret is just in the other room. Then it settles, and I know where I am, and what time it is, and what I have ahead of me. I make the tea, I check my phone, and I begin, again, to be careful. My name is Vincent. I am 60 years old. Before I tell you about Thailand, I need to tell you about the pub, because the pub is the reason everything in Thailand happened the way it happened. I had run a pub in Salford for 11 years. Not a destination pub, not a gastropub with craft beer and chalkboard menus. A real pub, a local pub, the kind of place where people came because they had always come, and where the regulars knew each other's names and family situations, and the particular combination of drinks that got each of them through whatever that week had been. I loved that pub. I was good at running it. I built a loyal trade, kept the staff turnover low, maintained the premises properly, and for 8 of those 11 years, turned a decent enough profit to support myself and pay down the lease, and save a modest amount each year that was earmarked, in my mind, as the foundation of whatever came next. What came next was the pandemic, then the rent review, then 2 suppliers who went under in the same quarter and left me carrying stock costs I had not budgeted for, then a VAT demand from HMRC that arrived at exactly the moment my cash reserve had been depleted by the supplier crisis, then the kind of compound financial pressure that does not kill a business all at once, but applies itself in accumulating increments, until one morning you look at the accounts and understand that the numbers do not work, and are not going to work, and that you have a choice between continuing for another 3 months while the hole gets deeper, or stopping now and salvaging what you can. I stopped. The insolvency process took 14 months. When it was done, I had £210,000 remaining, which was the residue of the pub's fixtures, and the lease transfer, and a small amount I had managed to sequester in a personal account that the insolvency practitioners confirmed was outside the scope of the proceedings. £210,000, after 11 years of work. It felt like holding a handful of water. My sister Karen, in her specific way, said, "Come and stay with us for a bit." My ex-wife, who I had been separated from for 6 years by that point, said nothing, because we were not in contact. The friends from the pub had their own lives and their own problems, the kind that multiply in Salford during a recession, and the social network that the pub had maintained for me dissolved in the way that venue-based social networks always dissolve when the venue is no longer there. I was 59 years old, I had £210,000, and I had no idea what to do with either of those facts. So I did what people in that situation do when they have just enough money to do it. I booked a flight somewhere warm, and told myself I was taking a holiday to clear my head. Thailand was the destination because a man I knew from the pub, a retired electrician named Graham, who had spent a month in Phuket 5 years earlier, had talked about it often enough in the context of what you could do with money out there, that the idea had lodged in my head. Not romance, not lifestyle, not escape, business, what you could get for your money. The pub industry in the UK had been my entire adult professional life, and the pub industry in the UK was, in my direct experience, an absolute meat grinder for your capital, and the idea of a place where the same capital could buy you something with more room in it, more margin, more possibility, less HMRC correspondence, had a practical appeal that was not about the beaches or the temples or any of the things people usually say about Thailand. I was not going for a holiday. I was going to look at what was possible. Phuket in October is just past the rainy season. The roads are still wet dark in the mornings, and the vegetation is the specific saturated green of somewhere that has been well rained on, and the beaches on the western coast are rough and dramatic in a way that is more interesting, to me, than the postcard calm of the dry season. I had booked a guest house in Kamala, which is a village on Phuket's western coast, north of Patong, quieter than Patong, more residential, a place where people actually lived, rather than just passed through on their way to nightclubs. The guest house was small and clean, and the woman at the front desk spoke excellent English and had a laminated folder of local business information that she offered to guests who asked, which I did on the second morning. Her name was Cream. She was 27, efficient, with a specific kind of composed professionalism that I associated with people who had been trained in hospitality rather than who had simply ended up in it. She answered my questions about the local business landscape with the precision of someone who had thought about these questions before or who found them genuinely interesting. When I asked about investment opportunities in the Phuket hospitality sector, because I asked, I initiated this, she did not push anything at me. She said she happened to know of a development project in the Kamala area that was looking for investment partners. She said this carefully, without pressure, and offered to get me some information if I was interested. I said I was interested. But you have to understand, I know. I was not naive about investment due diligence. I had run a business. I understood cash flow projections. I understood occupancy rate assumptions. I understood the difference between a glossy presentation and a viable business model. When the folder arrived at the guest house reception 2 days later, 12 pages, professionally printed, with photographs of the plot, architectural renders of the proposed boutique resort, projected occupancy rates, a 5-year revenue model, the company registration documentation, the land title records, the name and contact details of a law firm in Phuket Town, I read it the way I had read supplier proposals and lease documents in the pub business. Critically, with my former publican's nose for something that did not add up. I could not find what did not add up. That is the honest truth. The documents looked right. The registration number was real. I checked it online, and it returned a company record. The projected returns were aggressive, but not absurdly so, in a sector that was genuinely recovering post-pandemic, on a timeline that the actual tourism data I looked up appeared to support. The asking investment for a founding partner stake was 4.5 million baht, which at the October exchange rate was approximately £96,000. For a 30% equity stake in a development that the prospectus valued at 25 million baht on completion. The numbers made sense. That is the thing I cannot get past even now. The numbers made sense. I met Cream for coffee 3 days after the folder arrived. This was November. I had extended my stay without really making a conscious decision to extend it, just kept not booking the return flight. We talked about the project for 2 hours. She knew it in detail. She knew the land vendor, the construction company, the architect, the projected timeline. She knew the hospitality market in that part of Phuket with a specificity that came from living there, not from reading reports. She was not selling me. That is the distinction I keep returning to. She was answering my questions. And my questions were good questions, and her answers were consistent and detailed, and she pulled out her phone twice to show me things she was referencing, rather than just asserting, which in my experience of people who are trying to sell you something, is not what they do. I went back to the UK in December. I told Graham about the project over a pint in Salford, and Graham, who had been to Phuket and had some residual sense of the property market there, said, "Sounds interesting, Vince. Just get a local lawyer to check the documents." I said I would. I did not at that point, and I want to be honest about why. Because getting a local lawyer involved felt like the act of someone who did not trust the situation, and I trusted the situation, and not trusting things had cost me the pub by making me slow to act when I should have moved, and I was not going to make that mistake again. This is the sunk cost mentality that the description of my character so accurately names. I had already lost so much that caution felt like a second loss, and I could not afford a second loss, and so I made the decision to act. I transferred £96,000 in January. The company banking details were in the prospectus. The transfer went through cleanly. Cream sent a confirmation email within 2 hours, with an investment agreement attached, signed by the company director, stamped, professional. She sent a second email a week later, with a construction timeline and the name of the site foreman, and a photograph of the plot with survey markers in the ground. I had the photograph on my phone for months. I still have it. I do not know whose plot it is. By March I was back in Phuket, staying in a rented room in Rawai on the south of the island this time. Not at Cream's guest house. I had moved to something cheaper since I was planning to be there for a longer stretch. I visited the plot twice with Cream. It was real land, a cleared site with survey markers and what appeared to be the beginning of a foundation, and standing on it in March, with the Andaman Sea visible in the distance between 2 hills and the construction equipment parked at one edge of the site, I felt, despite everything I had been through in Salford, The specific relief of something beginning, something that was mine, or partly mine, in a place where the numbers were different, and the possibilities were different, and nobody knew about the pub, or the insolvency, or the VAT demand. The project needed more capital in April. This is the part of the story I find hardest to tell, not because it was the worst part, but because it was the most avoidable, and I did not avoid it. The construction company had revised the foundation costs. Cream explained this with documents I did not read carefully enough, in retrospect, because they were in Thai, with an English summary that I accepted as equivalent, and the shortfall required an additional 2.1 million baht from the investment partners, divided proportionally. My share of the additional requirement was £45,000. Cream presented this as a standard development variance, the kind that happens in any construction project, and she was right that it happens in any construction project, and I transferred the £45,000 in April. In May there was a planning approval issue. This is the thing I should have stopped at, and I know it. And I am telling you this not as an excuse but as the specific mechanism, because I think it matters. A planning approval issue sounds serious, but Cream explained it as administrative. The local authority had required additional environmental documentation that the architect was preparing, a standard requirement, a 6-week delay at most. The delay meant the construction company was holding equipment idle and was threatening to demobilize to another project, which would cost substantially more to remobilize than keeping them on site during the delay. The additional cost to hold the construction contract in place was 1.1 million baht split between partners. My share was £22,000. I transferred it in May. I had now put in £163,000. This is the number that matters, not the original £96,000. The total £163,000. Because by May I was not making investment decisions anymore. I was making sunk cost decisions. The difference is this: an investment decision asks whether the expected future return justifies the capital committed. A sunk cost decision asks whether you can psychologically accept having already lost what you have already committed, and concludes that you cannot, and commits more money to avoid confronting the original loss. I had been through the pub. I had been through the insolvency. I could not be the man who had lost the pub and lost his investment in Thailand. I could not carry both of those things. So I paid the £22,000 in May, and I told myself it was a sensible business decision, and I was lying to myself in the specific way that financial desperation permits. And then she said the business needed £50,000 more. And something in me finally, at last, could not do it. I do not know whether it was the size of the number or the timing, or some specific quality in the way Cream presented the request. She called this time, rather than emailed, which was unusual. But when she said the development required a further capital injection of approximately £50,000, and that it needed to be in place within 2 weeks, or the construction contract would be terminated, I sat in the rented room in Rawai, and I felt something I had not felt since the beginning of the project. I felt the request land differently, like it had a weight that the previous requests had not had. I said I needed to think about it. I said I would call her back in the morning. That evening I wrote to an expat forum I had found through a Facebook group for British residents in Phuket. I described the project in general terms, the structure, the timeline, the additional capital requests, and asked whether this sounded familiar to anyone, with experience of development investment in the area. The thread sat quiet for 6 hours. Then, at 11 o'clock that evening, a private message arrived from a username I did not recognize. The message said, "I need to speak to you. I was in this exact same situation 18 months ago. It was not a real project. Call me." I called the number in the message. The man who answered was a Dutchman named Paul, who had been living in Chiang Mai for 3 years, and who had, 18 months before my situation, invested 3.8 million baht, approximately £86,000 at the exchange rate at the time, in a boutique resort development in the Kamala area of Phuket, presented by a woman he described. When he started describing her, I held the phone tighter. He described her age, her manner, her professionalism, the quality of the documents, the construction site visits, the sequential additional capital requests for foundation costs and planning delays. He had invested his total, and then been presented with a final large request, at which point he had also, as he put it, felt the request land differently. He had investigated. He had found a Thai lawyer named Kun Thaksin in Phuket town who specialized in investment fraud cases. By the time he reached a lawyer, the woman he had dealt with had gone and could not be contacted. The address on the company documents was a car wash on a side road behind the Kamala night market. I want to describe what it felt like to hear this information, because I have been asked, and I think the description matters. It did not feel like being punched. It felt like something I had been half expecting finally being said aloud. There was a quality of recognition in it, the specific recognition of something you have been carrying as a formless anxiety that suddenly has precise edges and a name. I sat in the rented room in Rawai, and I listened to Paul describe my own situation 18 months in advance, and I felt what I can only describe as a terrible clarity, clean and cold and absolute. I called Cream the following morning. The number rang 8 times and went to voicemail. I sent a WhatsApp message. It showed 2 ticks, and then, while I was watching the screen, showed a single tick. She had blocked me. I tried a different number I had for her from earlier in the correspondence. Disconnected. I went to the guest house in Kamala by taxi. It took 45 minutes, and a different young woman was at the front desk and had no knowledge of anyone named Cream, and had been at the guest house for 6 weeks and knew nothing of any previous staff. The manager, a Thai man in his 50s who spoke limited English, looked at the photograph on my phone and shook his head and would not say anything further. I called Kun Thaksin, Paul's lawyer, that afternoon. I was in a cafe near the guest house when I made the call, and I remember that there was a football match on the television in the corner of the cafe that I kept looking at while I was on the phone, because my eyes did not know where to go, and I remember the specific smell of the coffee that went cold in the cup in front of me while Kun Thaksin spoke. He had seen this structure before. Not from Cream specifically. He could not establish a connection between the case Paul had described and my situation, though the modus operandi was identical. He explained the company registration. Real, registered, but the registered address was not what I had been shown, and the director listed on the company documents was a name with no traceable identity, almost certainly nominal. The land I had visited, the plot with the survey markers, was real land, but was not in any way connected to the company I had invested in. It was, as far as Kun Thaksin could establish, a different development entirely, that happened to be at a publicly visible construction stage in the right area. They had taken me to look at someone else's project, and presented it as their own. I sat in the cafe long after the coffee was cold, and long after the football match had ended, and long after the cafe had started to fill up for lunch, and I went through the full accounting in my head, which was the worst kind of accounting, not pages and figures, but the memory of each decision and what I had been thinking when I made it. January, £96,000, the founding investment, the one I had done proper research on and still got wrong. April, £45,000, the foundation variance. May, £22,000, the planning delay. The total, £163,000. 77% of the money I had walked away from the pub insolvency with. Every pound of it transferred voluntarily to a real bank account attached to a real company registration, with documentation I had checked and found consistent, by a woman who had disappeared into Thailand like water into sand. The manic phase began that afternoon, if I am honest about it. I am going to call it what it was because I think naming it accurately is the only useful thing I can do with it. I made a list of every action I was going to take. I was going to file a police report. I was going to hire a private investigator. I was going to contact Interpol. I was going to go back through every email and identify every IP address. I was going to find Paul's lawyer and get him to engage his entire network to locate Cream's identity. I was going to post on every expat forum in Thailand with a description and a warning. I was going to get the story to the British Embassy, to the Thai Consumer Protection Board, to the Thai Tourism Authority. I was going to pursue this across every available channel simultaneously, with the specific energy of a man who has been comprehensively wronged and who finds, in the anger, a clarity of purpose that the preceding months had been slowly eroding. Kun Taksin, who I met in person 2 days later in his office in Phuket town, was patient and thorough. He told me to file the police report, which I did. He told me the private investigator was unlikely to produce results because the identity documentation used in these schemes was designed to be untraceable, but he would make inquiries. He told me the company bank account had been closed 3 days before I attempted to call Cream, which confirmed that the timeline had been planned and that the final £50,000 request had likely been the intended final extraction before the exit. The fact that I had not paid it was irrelevant to my loss but was notable. It meant I had, without realizing it, refused the final payment at the last possible moment. Whether that was instinct or luck, or the specific intervention of Paul's message from Chiang Mai, I could not say. The police report was filed. The investigation was opened and progressed at the pace of Thai criminal proceedings, involving a fraudster with no fixed address and a company registered to a nom de plume. I called Karen from Phuket town at 8 in the evening on a Thursday, which was 9 in the evening in Manchester, and I told her what had happened in the specific flat way that you tell people things when you have already processed them as far as you can process them alone. Karen said, "Come home, Vince." I said I did not know if I could come home. Not financially, I meant emotionally. Coming home meant arriving back in Salford with the pub gone and the Thailand money gone, and nothing left but the £47,000 that remained in my UK account, which was the only portion of the £210,000 I had kept back and had not touched. Coming home meant being 60 years old and starting from numbers I had not seen since my 30s, in a country whose business landscape I already knew had no room for me in the way I wanted to be in it. Karen said, "You can come home and be angry here. You don't have to sort it out in Thailand." That landed. I did not go home immediately. I stayed another 3 weeks, attending to the police report follow-up, and 2 further meetings with Kun Taksin, and one genuinely surreal afternoon, where I drove to the car wash behind the Kamala night market and sat outside it for 20 minutes, looking at people getting their vehicles washed, which resolved nothing but felt like something I needed to do. Then I went to Phuket International Airport on a Tuesday morning and took the connection to Bangkok and flew back to Manchester. I want to tell you what I know now, clearly and without the defensiveness that I am aware runs through parts of this account like a wire I cannot remove from the structure. The first thing I know is that a professionally constructed fraudulent investment prospectus is indistinguishable from a real one to someone who does not have independent professional verification. This is not a comforting thing to know, and it does not make me feel less foolish, but it is accurate. The difference between what Cream presented and a legitimate investment document was not visible in the documents themselves. It was visible in the land registry records, the actual company director's identity, the law firm whose letterhead was borrowed without their knowledge or involvement, and the construction site, which belonged to a completely different development. None of these things were verifiable by reading the documents. They required independent inquiry. The document verification that Graham had recommended, and I had not done, would have caught at least 3 of these discrepancies within a week. 1 week, from a local lawyer, at a cost of perhaps £300 to £500, against £163,000. I want that number to sit with you for a moment. The second thing is about the sunk cost mechanism, which I think is underestimated as a vulnerability in these schemes. The additional requests in April and May were not random, they were calibrated. The April request was large enough to be the kind of additional investment a real development might require, but not so large that it felt like a separate decision. It felt like a continuation of the January decision. The May request was smaller still, £22,000 against an existing commitment of £141,000, which made it feel trivially rational in proportion to what was already in place. Each additional payment was designed to be easier to make than to refuse, because refusing meant acknowledging the possibility that the original investment was lost, and I was psychologically incapable of acknowledging that. The scheme was not primarily a fraud on my judgment. It was a fraud on my emotional relationship to the money I had already lost. That is a more sophisticated target and a harder one to defend. The third is this, and I want to say it directly. The most dangerous investor in any scheme is the one who has recently survived a financial loss. Not because they are less intelligent, because they are more motivated. The sunk cost mentality of a man who has already lost something significant makes him willing to commit to things he would otherwise examine more carefully, because examining means risk, and risk means the possibility of another loss, and another loss is the one thing he absolutely cannot face. I was the ideal investor for a scheme like Cream's. I had enough money to be a target, enough desperation to make fast decisions, and enough recent experience of failure to make caution feel like the enemy rather than the protection. If you are reading this from a position of recent financial loss, I am asking you specifically to stop and hear me. The next opportunity you are presented with is the most important one to verify independently, not the least important. Your desperation is an asset to someone who knows how to use it. I am back in Manchester now. The £47,000 is in a savings account. I do work for a hospitality consultancy on a contract basis. 10 years of running a pub turns out to be worth something to companies trying to understand the operational side of the sector, even when the pub itself is gone. I am not rebuilding anything. I am maintaining. That is a different thing, and it has taken me several months to make my peace with the distinction. There is no Thailand Chapter 2. There is no resort, obviously. There is no woman named Cream in any database that Kun Taksin or the Phuket police have been able to find. Paul, the Dutchman from Chiang Mai, sends me a message occasionally. We have a kind of solidarity that is specific to people who have been taken by the same invisible hand and who have found each other in the aftermath. The police investigation is open. It will most likely remain open. The money is gone. At least I did not give her the last 50,000. That is the only version of this story that ends with something that might, if the light is right and you squint a bit, look like winning.